the Israelis are trying to push for a ground invasion of Rafah as well as they have done with the north, with the middle area, with Khan Yunis, and right now with Rafah. And numbers are really have reached really harrowing levels. Starvation. Most numbers are more than half. Some of them have gone up until 70% in the number of people who are starving, the number of people who cannot reach food, the number of people who need like immediate medical intervention. So today we will be having a discussion on these things, and we will be talking about action and what could be done more than what's been done already. And so sorry. Yes. So, so the discussion today, of course, will be about Rafah, but the situation in Gaza in general is really bad, as you all know. In the north, right now, again, the Israeli army has gone again and invaded the Shifa hospital, and as they have done in as they have done in all of Gaza, they have always been targeting hospitals and therefore targeting refugees and displaced people and people who have limited to no access to humanitarian aid, to food, to medical treatment, etc. So just give me a second, please. Okay, so let's start with just give me a second. Sorry for the. One second. Sorry about this. Just a small technical issue. So let's start with Mr. Chris Nineham. Can you please give us a general overview of what's happening right now in Gaza and how the situation is unfolding?
Hi, everyone. Did you say you want us to just talk for 3, 4, 5 minutes? Did I hear that right?
Yes.
Okay. I'll strip down what I wanted to say because that's just a very brief summary you're talking about. And what I wanted to talk about a little bit is the impact of the absolutely catastrophic assault on Gaza, on international institutions and on the legitimacy of the governments in the West. That's really what I wanted to mainly focus on. I mean, it's quite clear that the level of destruction, the level of carnage, the level of murder that is being unleashed by the Israeli assault is unprecedented and is something that hasn't happened in this region, certainly since the Nakba. And in many ways, this is, as people have documented, actually in terms of the figures, in terms of the numbers, in terms of the level of destruction, much worse than the Nakba itself. And I think other people on this panel are probably in a better position than me to outline exactly the details of that and to discuss the human toll and the level of destruction in detail. I just wanted to say I think it's very important to recognise that this has created a kind of series of political and institutional crises around the world. And I think these stem from the fact that partly the world is witnessing the level of killing and the level of destruction in a way that it hasn't done before. populations around the world are kind of experiencing this genocide in real time due to social media, which is undercutting and getting round, certainly in the Western countries, what is basically a very, very poor response from the mainstream media. I think, secondly, we are in unprecedented territory because the Israeli government, for a combination of geopolitical and immediate domestic reasons, is defying the wishes of the US establishment, in particular, and the Western powers, for it to be more careful about its attacks, for it to be more limited in terms of the kind of military operation it is undertaking. And the third thing, I think, is that they are responding to a situation in which US power in the region and internationally is at a low ebb. And for all these reasons, we are witnessing a immensely significant, historic and destabilizing series of events taking place. And I think in two ways, this is having a big impact on the global scene, and particularly on the legitimacy of the Western powers. First of all, it's clear that the US and its immediate allies, in particular the British government, unfortunately, are isolated geographically in a way that they haven't been, certainly on this issue, on the issue of Israel-Palestine before, and perhaps not on any other foreign policy issue in recent history. This is obviously evidenced in the votes that have been taking place in the United Nations, but it's absolutely clear that the majority of countries around the world are simply not sympathetic or supportive of what the Western powers are doing, and this is a new development. Secondly, I think they are isolated socially and even in their amongst their domestic populations. I mean, all the figures show growing unease in the US amongst the population at large at what is going on here, but also interestingly, amongst the Jewish population in the United States. And in Britain, we have a situation where 66 to 70% of the population think there should be a ceasefire. In other words, are opposed to what their government is doing. And only 13% of the British population support what the Israelis are doing. And I just think it's important to recognize these figures when we come to look at the kind of potential for opposition, the potential for not just a world movement, but the leveraging of world public opinion against what Israel is doing.
Yes.
It strikes me, it is very significant that now there is rumours that you will no doubt have heard that the US itself is putting together a draft resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, which obviously will be far too limited for all of our tastes, but nevertheless is a massive, if true, is a massive development, which kind of signifies their weakness and their isolation on the world stage.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's just
Yes.
to conclude, I think it's on the one hand, it's a desperate situation in terms of the humanitarian plight of the people in Gaza, but it's also a situation in which the very legitimacy of the Western powers that have dominated the world for so many decades is being brought into question here.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chris. So we move on to Professor Dan Kovalik, a professor and human rights lawyer. Welcome to our webinar. So it has been 6 months now, and we have been waiting for any move. There has been various motions at the UN, and the US has vetoed all of them basically, or have withdrew any kind of power to any of them. So no ceasefire has happened so far, and the humanitarian situation has gotten worse. So moving on from what the world powers have done so far, what can activists and people do? Because the situation has just reached a level where every 2 days we think there will be another round of negotiations, and suddenly either the Israeli part or the other part are like, we don't like this draft or we don't like that draft. So what should be done immediately?
Well,
The
first of all,
question is
thanks
for,
for
yeah,
having me.
please.
Also, I just want to first start by saying, I think the situation is much graver than the numbers we're getting suggest. Ralph Nader wrote a piece saying he thinks probably 200,000 Palestinians have already died. I think he's probably right. We've been relying on Palestinian health ministry information for the fatalities, but where do they get it from? Hospitals and clinics, right? And they're not functioning. So I think it's a terrible situation happening, and the pressure is helping. I mean, the pressure, particularly in the United States, on the Democratic Party, on Democratic leaders such as Joe Biden and senators. You see, Charles Schumer is already he's weakening. He started to criticize Netanyahu. That type of personal pressure on politicians has to continue. These politicians cannot be allowed to go out in public, cannot be allowed to go to restaurants or go to the cinema or the symphony without being bothered by activists who hold them to account for this genocide. I think those tactics are working. I think the protests are working. I wish they were working more quickly, but they are working. The tide is turning. Biden knows he cannot win this election given the current circumstances. He's now known as Genocide Joe, and that moniker needs to continue to be used. I think he's trying to find a way out of this, and we have to continue to force him to try to do that through more direct actions, more aggressive actions, sitting in federal buildings, sitting in congressional leaders' offices, going to their homes, like people have gone to the home of Anthony Blinken, I think pretty much every day. We here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I live, have been going to the residence of Senator Fetterman and protesting there. Again, I think those are the things that need to continue happening. And the demands have to be, of course, an immediate ceasefire, the full funding of UNRWA, which the U.S. continues to withhold funding from that agency, which is devastating not only to the people of Gaza, but all the 6 million Palestinian refugees in the region. And, we have to call for those trucks that are at the Rafah border to be allowed in. The trucks are there. They're ready to go in, and Israel's preventing them from going in. And when some do go in, they're firing at people gathering for aid. Almost every day now we're hearing of these so-called flower massacres that the Israelis are being carried out, and that needs to be denounced. This idea Biden has for the port, this so-called humanitarian port, I think is a ruse. They say it'll take 60 days to build that. The people of Gaza don't have 60 days. I think it was like 2 weeks ago, the UN predicted 500,000 Palestinians were on the verge of famine. Well, when does being on the verge of famine become being in the process of famine? I think the famine started. We're seeing pictures of dead babies dying from malnutrition. Disease is spreading. So there's no time for a port to be built. So yeah, this type of pressure needs to be kept on. I think also protest at the United Nations as well. The UN has utterly failed its mandate in this to stop this. It's just shameful. So yeah, I think that type of direct action needs to continue.
Yes.
Beyond that, I don't know what else to say. I think that I feel honored to be in the United States, where I can actually, my pressure might do something to change this situation. Living in the belly of the beast, as Che Guevara said. So,
yeah. Yes. So now for the people who are actually in Rafah, most of them also have some hope maybe in the people of Egypt and people who are in neighboring countries as well. mean, of course, the pressure that's done from the US is very important, as
Yes.
all the weapons and most of the weapons are shipped from there. But also, people in Rafah have to pay a lot of money to just cross the border to
Yes. Thousands of dollars.
safe areas with their families. Yes. So a lot of them have hope in the people of Egypt and the people of Jordan to move, and on the governments of these countries as well. But so far, nothing has been done. I mean, and this question is for you, Noah Schindlinger. She's an assistant professor of Middle East history at the Department of History and Political Science at Worcester State University. So historically, we know that these people consider themselves to be not only neighbors, but almost like cousins of the Palestinians. But we haven't seen even the same marches as we have seen in the West. So what is happening?
Yeah, I am not that trusting of any political leaders in any government. First of all, the government of Egypt is a major recipient of US aid, one of the biggest recipients of US aid in the region, together with Turkey and Israel. That means the United States is in a position to pressure Egypt, right, to do its bidding, right? We know that historically Egypt, after Nasser, betrayed the Palestinians, right? After 73, Egypt pivoted and entered negotiations with Israel and then signed a peace agreement. We know that Egypt has been enforcing the siege on Gaza. So I actually don't have hope when it comes to trying to trust us, the Sisi government, or anything that he says in a very performative way. The Egyptian people are it's a different matter, right? The Egyptian people are, of course, supportive, but also the Egyptian people have been through revolution that succeeded momentarily, and then, of course, a round of bloodshed, and then the emergence of another military regime. So I don't see a solution coming from Egypt or I mean, and obviously other US allies in the region. I mean, Jordan, that has been very performatively providing some aid. I also don't trust the Biden government. I was just saying this to a friend. My friend was saying, well, do you think Biden has realized that he made a mistake with his bear hug of Israel, and now he's trying to maybe impose some kind of a solution? I said to the friend, no, see, this is why it's important to know the history, because if you go back over 10 years ago, after the first after Assad's first chemical attack, it's Obama, who said, oh, red lines, we're not going to let that happen, right? And then Obama, of course, let it happen and abandon Syrians. And of course, Biden was part of that administration. Do not put your faith in these leaders. And I also said to him, well, the ICJ might end up providing some relief, but this is a very slow moving process. What we do have where we do have some hope is more countries like Canada making the decision to halt the supply of arms to Israel. What we might, yes, but we might actually get more of that. What we might have is some governments that will decide to maybe press charges against their citizens who are proven to be committing war crimes. Only yesterday there was a French citizen who is fighting in the Israeli military who bragged on camera about abusing Palestinian detainees, and now in the French parliament, they're calling to press charges. So we might see some of that. But
Hopefully.
but I urge caution about trusting Sisi or Biden, or not to mention the British government, right? And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of faith.
Yeah, that's most of us. So now, thank you for your input, Noah. So you have mentioned how the UNRWA, I mean, other guests also have mentioned how the UNRWA had their funds cut. And that is actually a major player in what's happening right now in Gaza and the starvation, how the aid is being targeted and all of that. So my next question is for Dr. Lex Stackenberg, a former director of UNRWA operations. So what do you expect in the coming days that will be happening? Maybe the situation will be resolved or the funding will come through. How do you see the situation unfolding in the coming days when it comes to aid?
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes.
You can hear me okay? Let me start by saying that what we are now witnessing on our screens in Gaza, in the north, dramatic hunger and starvation. In the south, equally a dramatic situation with 1.5 million people concentrated together. You know, let me remind your audience that we are dealing with a man-made humanitarian crisis that is an integral part of Israel's genocide perpetrated in the Gaza Strip. It is all the result, and I refer to genocide to also indicate that there is the design to create this humanitarian crisis. There is an explicit design to use hunger and starvation as an instrument of war, as an integral component of the genocide. Now, it's very clear that this constitutes a clear violation of the Genocide Convention and the ruling of the International Court of Justice late January in the case brought by South Africa. And so Israel is on notice, but of course has a record of sort of ignoring orders from the United Nations, whether it's the Security Council, the General Assembly, or now the International Court of Justice. But indirectly, it's also the supporters of Israel that are on order. And in early April, we will have a further set of hearings in The Hague in a case brought by Nicaragua against Germany, and by extension to all the other state parties to the Genocide Convention. And that case is about German and the other states' complicity with the ongoing genocide. Now, I'm bringing this up because I think it is beginning to show cracks in the extent to which sort of the Western elite that has supported Israel from 7 October onwards, first by expressing unreserved solidarity, then by continuing to extend political and diplomatic support for a number of countries, to continue to extend financial support, military support, etc. Cracks are beginning to show, not just in the U.S. administration, but also amongst European leaders like Schulz in Germany, Cameron in the UK, Macron in French, and others. I think they begin to realize, and this is being brought down by the devastating images indeed of starving children and dying children in the north of Gaza, that they may go down in the history books as facilitators, enablers, being complicit in the commission of genocide, in the biggest genocide of the 21st century. And I think it's starting to make them nervous. What we're also seeing, this has been a conflict of sort of the Western elite against the rest of the world. Western leaders against civil society in Western countries, and leaders and civil society in large parts of the rest of the world. And that begins to also reach such a momentum. There has been a tsunami, I would say, a tsunami of demonstrations, of expressions of solidarity by groups all over the world. There has been an increasing manifestation of legal action from the International Criminal Court to the ICJ. We just had the genocide case, then we had the advisory opinion being heard, and now the second genocide case in April, but also dozens of court actions in national courts, from the US to the Netherlands to Scandinavia to the UK to Germany. It's making Israel so nervous that yesterday there was a press report stating that the Israeli military is setting up a huge legal defense team to be prepared for the numerous war crimes challenges that are already on the way and are further expected in the months and I would say years to come. So there is a tremendous. There's on the one hand sort of the Western elite is still trying to side with Israel, but is getting nervous and is sort of stepping up its criticism. And so I believe we're at a pivotal moment, and Biden's trip to the region is a point, is a case in point. I mean, he has of course made many trips to the region, but we're now several months into the latest ceasefire negotiations, and I think one of the reasons he's there is sort of essentially to tell the Israelis to sort of not withdraw their delegation and stay there until a deal is made. So I think we're in a critical moment, and we're beginning to see change. And of course, it's late. 6 months we are in the crisis. I mean, it should have been much earlier.
Of course, it should have been more.
This is the reality.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much, Lex, for your input. So this, we all agree, should not go unpunished. But we have seen what happened with the genocide case at the ICJ, and the result was unbinding and binding, apparently. And so, is there something, an order that could be binding, something that could stop Israel from doing what it's doing right now? Of course, it's known historically to always bypass these orders. So my next question is for Sue Willman, a senior lecturer at King's College London. Will this ever be punished? And is there an actual order that can stop Israel from doing what it's doing right now? A court order?
Sadly, I think the answer is no. What we can use is political pressure. We can use the media. So I was going to talk about legal remedies, though, for those who are complicit in what's happening in Israel, especially in the UK, which is my expertise, because if we can't pressurize Israel, who, as has been said, even ignored the ICJ judgment, maybe we can pressurize their allies. And the first possible way of doing that, I'll just speak briefly because I know you wanted to focus more on the famine. The first possible way might be through what's called global human rights sanctions regime, or Magnitsky sanctions. There are sanctions regimes in most of the global north. The US started, there are sanctions regimes in Canada, in Europe, and in the UK, and that provides an option to freeze the assets of, if they're based in the UK, and also to put visa bans on. And the Arab Organization for Human Rights really took a brave move and asked the UK Foreign Office, David Cameron, to put sanctions on the Israeli war cabinet, including Netanyahu. It's interesting how these matters are being reported, isn't it? It's difficult to get certain issues into the press at the moment. But I wonder if a similar response approach could be tried in relation to any of those who we think are responsible for the famine. We focused on the war cabinet and we focused on some extremist settlers. And so far, the US has simply chosen 4 quite low-level Israelis who have been violent towards Israeli activists, pro-Palestinian activists, and against Palestinians, and the UK has followed suit. But one tactic could be for groups of NGOs to write to the UK Foreign Minister to try and put pressure on for human rights sanctions. Another route that's been tried in the UK is prosecution. So the International Centre for Justice for Palestine wrote to the British police SO15, who are responsible for prosecuting for war crimes, and asked them to investigate. They've asked them to investigate some of those going to fight for the IDF, but also British ministers saying that they were responsible for war crimes. Perhaps that same approach could be tried in relation to those who we think are responsible for starving women, children, and men in Gaza at the moment. And then a further approach, it's more procedural, but all of these approaches are kind of weak approaches that we're using to try to build up pressure and try to get some press coverage of what's happening and show the people in Gaza that we haven't forgotten them. So questions being asked through parliamentary questions led the UK last year to say that they were only supplying medical provisions and no lethal or military equipment to Israel. And that completely contradicted what they'd said in November, which said that they were deploying surveillance assets, which they said were to support their awareness in the region and provide reassurance to partners. So in the UK, the Foreign Office has to do a kind of human rights assessment where they're providing any kind of security and justice assistance. And my law firm, Dighton Pearce Glynn, we've been looking to see if we could find a client who would be willing to threaten court action against the Foreign Office in relation to not having conducted human rights assessments, in part to find out what kind of assistance is being provided. Lastly, there is the case about arms exports, and whilst it's good that cases are happening around the world, we know that the legal and judicial profession are not necessarily open to challenges, and the claim that was brought by Al-Haq to try to stop the UK from licensing arms was refused at the first stage. Permission was refused, even though it's a very low threshold. You only have to show that the case is arguable. And they were arguing that it was irrational to think that providing arms to Israel would not result in a serious risk, a clear risk of a serious breach of international humanitarian law. Now, that case is being appealed, and they're trying to get an urgent hearing, but obviously all these things take time, and in the meantime, children are dying in Gaza through lack of food. So I suppose I would say that I think lawyers should carry on looking creatively to try to find any possible way of drawing the situation into the public domain. And it's great that you've organised this meeting so that we can share our ideas and try to work together towards that goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So my next question is for Mr. Edward Ahmed Mitchell, the National Deputy Executive Director of CARE. So Mr. Edward, what kind of campaigns are there any campaigns being carried out on the ground to gather aid and funding for aid for Palestinians? I mean, as this is the month of Ramadan, and they are definitely expecting more from their Muslim brothers and sisters.
Thank you all for hosting us. Again, Edward Ahmed Mitchell on behalf of the Council on American Islamic Relations. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu rasulullah. So number one, the American Muslim community, of course, like many other communities, has been, donating to support relief efforts in Palestine. The problem is that relief isn't getting in. We can donate all the money in the world, but if the land routes are blocked and if all we're getting is piecemeal airdrops of food, that's not going to stop the famine. So the American Muslim community's focus has really not been on donating to aid relief. It's been on putting pressure on our government, on President Biden and Congress, to stop enabling the genocide. I think I spoke with you all, it was maybe a few months ago, and at the time, the president was, indifferent to that pressure. Congress the same. We really have seen a sea change, and that's because the pressure has slowly but surely started to work. The administration's feeling that pressure, not only through lobbying, not only through the protests that are disrupting their public events, but also in voting. We have our presidential primaries happening in our country right now. They're not competitive per se, because it's well known that President Biden and former President Trump are on their way to getting the nominations. But the voters have used these primaries as an opportunity to cast uncommitted votes or to cast blank votes to express their displeasure with the president's policy. You've had 100,000 people do that in Michigan, thousands of people doing it in various other states. So all that combined, the lobbying at Congress, the protests, disruption of public events, the uncommitted vote, has put incredible pressure on the president to change course. You combine that with the fact the Israeli government is just out of control. They're not even pretending to be doing anything other than committing a genocide. We have been able to see through social media, and the people of this country have seen through social media, the impacts of the famine. We're seeing kids reduced to skeletons. We're seeing babies dying in the hospital just because they can't get any food. That is an impact, right? 20 years ago, Americans could only get their news about what is happening in Palestine through our three major news channels, which were typically very biased in favor of the Israeli government's narrative. Now people are getting their news directly through social media. They can see for themselves what is happening. So the pressure has been increasing. The pressure has been working to some extent. It's gotten the president to change his rhetoric, right? You're seeing him be much more critical of the Netanyahu government. You're seeing even in Congress, our senators speaking up much more forcefully about the Netanyahu government, but no one's willing to change the policy. We're just seeing change rhetoric, but not a real change in policy. Our president could stop this tomorrow if he wanted to, right? He could just say, you're not getting any more bombs, you're not getting any more bullets unless you let the aid in, unless you stop the indiscriminate bombing. But our government is not willing to do that at this point. They're not willing to use the leverage they have, which is American military and financial support to the Israeli government. So that is where the pressure is now, to get the president to move from change rhetoric to an actual change policy. You are seeing some hints that if Israel invades Rafah and does what everyone expects they would do there, which is a massacre, that might actually lead to some drastic change. There have been some rumors of that in our public reporting here in the United States, that might lead to some restrictions or limitations on aid. I'll believe it when I see it. But the fact that that's even in the ether, that's even being discussed or floated about in mainstream news channels, does indicate that change is happening. And so I think for us in America, as American Muslims, our main focus again is not really on aid. Yes, we are donating, but our real main focus is trying to pressure our government to stop the genocide, to stop the famine. Because as long as our government's policy does not change, we can, send all the aid in the world. It's not going to get in. It's not going to make a difference unless the genocide ends and aid workers can freely operate in Gaza once again. Inshallah. Taki, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Sophia, we can't hear you.
Yes. Yes. Can you hear me now?
You're good now.
Yes. Thank you very much for your input. So moving on to our next guest, Naomi Barasa. She's a Kenyan social justice activist. So as we have said in the introduction, we need more ideas to how activists on a global level can pressure their own governments and the Israeli government to stop the genocide that's unfolding. So the floor is yours. Naomi, can you hear us? Hello.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for
Yes.
having me
Welcome.
here. I am honored to be on this platform. My name is Naomi Barasa. I am a Kenyan activist and I'm the chair for Kenya Palestine Solidarity Movement in this country. And yeah, I mean, there's just like Comrade Lex mentioned, the tide is changing, particularly because of the tsunami, and I'll use his expression of tsunami that we are seeing in streets of almost every country on this planet. And initially, a lot of the people who are supporting this genocide, and including Israel itself, wanted to show that our actions were meaningless. They did not contribute to anything, and they almost gave us the attitude of, so what, nothing will change with your actions. But clearly we can now see there's a turn at some point that is happening. Even we've heard about the kind of pressure that Biden is experiencing. And so it is very important. And one of the things I've been telling people is that whatever action, whatever show of solidarity we take is not in vain, and we must continue. And in Kenya, I'm also a member of the Pan-African Solidarity Movement, Palestinian Solidarity Movement. And so we've been mobilizing in the country, but also mobilizing at the regional level. And one of the things that I must emphasize is that this political pressure must continue, also because it's very important every time how our governments will vote at the UN Security Council, but it's also very important the kind of narratives, how they nuance their position at the UN Security Council. So it's very important for us to continue with that political pressure, to also push our governments to have pro-human rights, but also humanity foreign policies. Some do not even understand what being pro-Palestine means. We can try and tweak it a little more to their understanding, using pro-human rights and pro-humanity approaches, so that they can be able to minimize the kind of aggression and the kind of aggression and hostility towards Palestine. The other thing that we have been doing, and I think it's very important that we start checking, especially for those countries that purport, and I say purport, now I am no longer so trustful of many of these policies. We have countries, like many of the Scandinavian countries have these policies they are calling feminist foreign policies. We must start poking holes into such policies, because any feminist policy cannot be a policy that endorses harm on human beings. So we must start poking holes into such things. And I'm very excited. I was very excited when I saw at the CSW, people attempted to block Israel from making its presentation, because it's a whole demonstration of hypocrisy. We cannot continue accepting this hypocrisy. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of educating the population, because like we have a lot of Christian Zionists, and a lot of the local populations who've been supporting Israel and getting brainwashed further, is because they do not understand what this issue, Palestinian Israeli issue, is. And a lot of them keep saying it's a conflict. It's not a conflict. We know it's the oppressed and the oppressor, the colonized and the colonizer. It is very clear. And in our nuancing, we must put that message out there very clearly by educating the populace. And finally, I would also want to say that the tsunami we are seeing in the world must also be brought onto the boycott, the BDS campaign, so that we not only deal with these people from a mindset change, but also from an economic change, an economic sanction and political sanctions. And as long as we'll be able to address attack from Israel from all sides, economically, politically, mindsets, and propaganda-wise, I'm sure we will be able to mount sufficient pressure on them. And lastly, we must equally hold publicly all the governments that are complicit accountable, because if America, for example, was not supporting Israel, Israel would not have sustained this war for like 3-4 weeks. So they are equally responsible, and now we must start calling them out for who they are, and very, very, very appropriately so. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for your input, Naomi. Of course, it is very important to keep the pressure, and boycott is definitely a part of it. So moving on to our next guest, Mr. Sorry, Mr. Harun Riza is a lawyer from 13 March movement. So Mr. Harun, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, welcome to our webinar. So the starvation is continuing, the pressure is happening on the governments, from activists, from lobbies, and still kids and children, women are dying. Like the numbers keep hiking, and as some of our guests said, the numbers could be much higher than what we see on the media. So what's your input on what's happening in Gaza?
Well, what the 30th of March movement is doing, and we've been doing that since December, we've been investigating individuals, especially IDF soldiers with dual nationality, either in the Netherlands or in Belgium and other countries, for example, France, which is a massive export of IDF soldiers who have dual nationality, Israeli and French. And we've been compiling a database of those soldiers who very publicly on social media, on TikTok, on Instagram, etc., have been parading around very proudly, showing what they've been doing there in Gaza. And we've already initiated proceedings in the Netherlands, for example. We've already lodged complaints with the ICC, but also with the Public Prosecutor's Office, with a request to prosecute these individuals on the basis of the Genocide Convention, as well as the Rome Statute and the local Dutch laws. And we are going to be doing the same things in Belgium and in France very soon. So what we're trying to do is get some type of investigation started in one of these countries. And we're very hopeful that eventually at the end of the day, it will result in at least some type of police investigation, and eventually some type of conviction, especially in Belgium, for example, where the law makes it a bit easier than in the Netherlands to get these criminals convicted. So that's what we've been doing. At the same time, we are also raising awareness regarding the situation in Gaza in general, and of course also the history behind it, because this isn't the first time Gaza has been attacked. This is, I think, the 5th time since 2008, if we're just looking at the recent history. So that's what we've been doing in general. And what we see is in the Dutch situation in the Netherlands is that there's a lot of pushback, especially from within the institutions. The Bar Association, for example, has reprimanded me recently, and we're continuing on, to fight that. The prosecutor's office has historically been very reluctant to prosecute anybody regarding this issue, regarding anything that has to do with Israel and Palestine. But we are more hopeful this time because the evidence is in abundance, and it's being streamed live via Instagram, via TikTok, via other social media platforms. And Israeli soldiers are volunteering the evidence this time, which was different in 2008 and in the previous wars and genocides in Gaza. And because of that, that makes our task easier. However, we still have a huge obstacle regarding the way in which the Dutch prosecutor's office sees these war crimes. What you see is a clear bias in the way, for example, very rightfully so, ISIS members are prosecuted, which they should be, of course. But at the same time, if you look at the way that IDF soldiers are not investigated, because that's what's happening, they're not being investigated at all. There's a stark contrast in the way in which the prosecutor's office is positioning itself. But what we are going to do, and what we're going to do in the coming months, is we've already lodged complaints. We've already received some rejections from the prosecutor's office. So that means we go to phase 2, which is lodging complaints at the High Court level. We call it Article 12 procedure, in which we ask the High Court to order the prosecutor's office to, in fact, either conduct further investigations and or actually prosecute these individuals. And at the end of the day, look, we shouldn't, as lawyers, we shouldn't think that we'll see results within a few months. That's not going to happen, especially looking at the climate and the feeling within the institutions in Europe. However, if we look at the long term, and then I'm talking about 1 year to 5 years, I'm sure and I'm confident that we will see successful arrests and prosecutions in at least a few European countries. And as soon as we have one successful prosecution, we expect the dam to burst, so to speak, and we expect the rest of Europe to get into line as far as this is concerned. So that's what we are doing. And coming back to your point regarding the man-made famine in Gaza, which it clearly is, if there's ever been a genocide, which is as clear as we are seeing now, it's this one. And I think you'll have to be, excuse my language, you'll have to be deaf, dumb, and blind at the same time not to see this for what it is. And there are some cracks also in the way in which Dutch courts are looking at it. You might be familiar with the F-35 case regarding the export of spare parts, or at least for parts of for the F-35 fighters in Israel. During the first initial hearings, the complaint was lost, or at least the Dutch courts didn't accept the complaint. However, now at the High Court level, the High Court has acknowledged that there's at least a sure possibility that war crimes and human rights violations have been committed by Israel. And it's one of the first times in Dutch history that something like this has been stated by any court, let alone the High Court. So that's why we are seeing some type of movement. And that's why we in the 30th of March movement are fairly confident that at the end of the day, individuals, and we're targeting individuals firstly, and then ministers, and for example, other organizations which have been supporting this genocide after that. But we do see some movement in that case. So regarding your question, yes, it's clear that this famine is part of this orchestrated, man-made orchestrated genocide. And yes, there are real possibilities for getting individuals and organizations, and at the end of the day, ministers, prosecuted and eventually convicted, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harun Raza, for your input. And hopefully these cases come through and we see some serious prosecution for these individuals. So our next guest is Mr. Hani Al-Madhoun of the Soup Kitchen project. So Mr. Hani, can you tell us more about this project from Gaza?
Great. Thank you, everyone. Ramadan Kareem for those who celebrate. My name is Hani. I do a lot of things with my life. I know some of you professionally, but out of frustration, my family actually, I'm based in the United States, but my family lives in Gaza, specifically in North Gaza. They're one of the folks who did not evacuate. I don't know, it depends how you look at it. Fortunate, misfortunate, they remain in the north. And unfortunately, they're being starved. You know, this is the situation where in December and January, I've learned my family and I've seen the pictures and the images and the videos of them eating and grinding food meant for pigeons and rabbits that doesn't even fit any human consumption standard, and it smells already bad. So, you know, we kept hearing about these agonizing stories, and, you know, we tried to send money. We obviously were limited to what we can send in the north. And, you know, that was the challenge, let alone we can't even call them. Imagine if we want to do something for the community that you can't establish a line of communication and you cannot get the money. That's some of the puzzles we have to solve. Eventually, we worked around those two issues. So we were able to establish a connection and deliver and get some money out. And then happened the IDF pulled back from a lot of the land in Beit Lahia. So Beit Lahia is in north of Gaza. It is a farming town traditionally. And when the elements of the Israeli army evacuated some of part of the north, some of the people who have farms went back to their farms, and they were able to get some potatoes, some zucchinis, eggplants, not a lot, but some. But the zucchinis were the size of a pumpkin because they were not picked. They were supposed to be picked 2 months or 6 weeks before. So my brother went and purchased a lot of zucchinis that are overgrown and cooked them up. So originally, he didn't want to do a soup kitchen. He wanted to go buy food from a local kitchen. So he bought rice, bought 100 meals, gave them away to our friends and neighbors. And then he went back to the store and they said, sorry, I don't have any rice. I don't have anything. And the guy went out of business. Then we said, hey, we have to help our family. You know, a lot of people they know me. They're like, hey, Hanny, here's $200. Help, stuff like that. So all of a sudden it added up. Then we started doing food parcels. There are 6 items that are available commercially in Gaza right now in the north. Basically, cooking oil, margarine, ketchup, tomato paste, za'atar spice, which is a dip, and maybe, you know, they will find other element like a grain or something like that, but nothing really is available. What is not available is rice and flour. So these are the main staples. So Mahmoud said, my brother, he said, I'm going to start cooking up meals for people. And he bought 3 large pots, got some veggies, some tomato paste, and some salt and seasoning. And the first day, 120 people went home with food. And he's a foodie. He likes to eat, but he started cooking. He went home thinking that's it, I did a good deed, khalas. And then he was surprised that kids showed up at his house the next day asking for food because they said, hey, nobody's showing up. This is the North. And mind you, I'm affiliated with a number of international NGOs. Some of them have $1 billion budget. I've been begging to get food to my family in the North for 4 months and nobody is able to do anything. So we felt, a lot of people felt a little bit of being abandoned, you know, and not, you know, governments don't show up for the people right now. So the next day he cooked up another meal and kept going. He did it first 3 times a week. And now with Ramadan, it cooks up daily. Up to 500 families show up and they get food. Basically, it's soup. You know, we're not able, we did yesterday, we cooked up rice. And we went to the Kamal Adwan Hospital. For those who don't know, Kamal Adwan Hospital is the ground zero for malnourished kids. That's where 2 weeks ago, 2 kids passed away from severe dehydration and malnourishment, and then there's a few kids left behind with their parents. So they started cooking for the hospital, and what they found is even the medical staff were starved. And that was like, we couldn't imagine how like the doctors and the patient are all, and again, we're doing soup. Maybe we got them one time bread, rice, and we're doing that 3 times a week because of the support and love we're getting from the community. And this is definitely a case where my family is cooking food for their friends and neighbors, specifically in an area called Mashrou' Beit Lahia. And the cooking happens by Palestinians from farmed land, all that. It is limited. The disaster in Gaza is a lot larger than any response. Where if we provide food for 500 families, guess what? There's 10,000 other families who don't have food and nobody's showing up for them. So we're able to just do this for people as much as we can because these are our families, but it's not easy. My brother tells me the guy who brings him vegetable, there's 2 zucchini pickers got killed in a drone attack. So it is still pretty dangerous space, and I warn my brother to be mindful of his space, who comes in, who comes out, because it's always almost kids and elderly folks who have relatives and things like that. So this is where we feel this is a sense of obligation we're doing. And to my surprise, even my colleagues at my international NGO have been very supportive and sharing because we all want to do something about this. And we just happen to have a quick solution for this. And again, we really need more aid to go on the North airdrop. Fine, it's not ideal. There is already a system that's in place that's working. There is miles and miles of trucks waiting to be allowed. So families like me, like mine, can eat. They're not allowed. Obviously, we've heard from the great panelist here. The pier, I don't know what to think of that new pier. I mean, I don't really know why they're always finding these solutions seem to be always looking for a problem, right? There's 4 access points to Gaza. You could allow the food. That's it. You don't have to do Mission Impossible and do selfies and all that. I assure you, the stuff when Mahmoud he purchased American rice that most likely was dropped from a plane, so he can serve it to the Kamal Adwan hospital. And tell me there is little dignity in the whole airdropping situation. There is chaos. In fact, there is violence that happens because people are desperate. My brother tells me where the flower massacre happened. He said, I could have gone. This could have been me. I shy away because even without the Israeli firing, which happens frequently, unfortunately, there is people who are like, hey, I want this bag of flour. You give it to me because they're desperate. And what end up is my brother just buying the aid that goes in because there is really, you understand, the police in Gaza has been targeted more than once. And agencies like UNRWA was trying to be like, hey, we have to do this in such a dignified manner. The ultimate solution is we own Gaza, and my family ate pigeon and rabbit food. We should not be in this position. We may have different political opinions, but at the end of the day, we just wanted to do this out of frustration, the soup kitchen. And alhamdulillah, they're helping a lot of people as much as we can. And it just gave me one purpose, like as a Palestinian living on the outside. That's the one thing, the one bright spot in my day when I wake up and I see these pictures, because everything else is pretty messed up, pretty dark. And this is when I see somebody walking away with the soup. I just feel like, okay, I did something. I can't give him a ceasefire. I can give him something that they could break their fast or stop their starvation with. I'll just stop it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Hani, and we hope that your family and all the people of Gaza find their way to safety very soon. And it is it's a very beautiful project to know that Gazans are helping each other. And let's hope that your brother finds ways to continue with this amazing project. So next in our webinar, we have 2 recorded interventions of Mr. Paul Murphy, member of the Irish Parliament, and Michel Pieras, former MP at the Italian Parliament. So we will start with Michel Pieras with his intervention, and we will be listening to it now.
Yes, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you again to the Arab Organization for Human Rights in Britain for the kind invitation to attend this conference. As everyone knows, more than 5 months have passed since the attacks of October 7th. And after 5 months, the world is facing one of the largest humanitarian catastrophes in its recent history. Over than 30,000 civilians killed, half of them children, and 100,000 of injured seem to be not enough for Israel's thirst of revenge, as well as the tragedy of 1.5 million displaced people suffering hunger, illness and thirst crushed on the Rafah crossing seem not to be enough to convince the European and Western countries to recognize the war crimes of the Israeli regime, to pronounce a firm word of condemnation, to call things by their name. Recently, a delegation of 15 Italian MPs and members of humanitarian associations went to the Rafah border and had the sad opportunity to see with their own eyes what is happening on the ground. I can assure to everybody that no one of them is an anti-Semitic politician, and not less than a democratic person. At the same time, I can testify to you their shock in front of the border of an ongoing genocide. In these days, the European Union and the United States are shipping billions of euro and US dollars to Ukraine to support their resistance facing the brutal and illegal Russian aggression. So the question is, what is wrong with them? Which is the reason that moves them to recognize one situation as an invasion and one other not? Which is the reason of this unbearable double standard if we speak of the Ukrainian rights to independence and the same indispensable right for the Palestinians? What I believe is that the call for ceasefire is no longer enough, because it doesn't completely recognize the massacre of the Palestinian people of Gaza, as well as the sweltering occupation of the West Bank, the thousands of Palestinian victims that came before October 7th. I believe that what is happening in Gaza clarifies better than any statement and declaration what are the projects of the Israeli fascist far right. And therefore nothing will be as it was. Nobody will be allowed anymore to appeal as right to defense what is a clear case of ethnic cleansing. You know that we are in the month of Ramadan, one of the most sacred passages for millions of Muslim believers, certainly one of the bloodiest the world is able to remember. The wish for everyone, from a layman as I am, is for a turning point in the behavior of the international community, a resolute action to stop the massacre in Gaza and the occupation, for a just peace process in Palestine, a diplomatic solution that has to be imposed to the fighting parties, that has necessary to take in charge the safety of everyone, the recognition of an independent Palestinian state, the supremacy of the international law and the human rights. Thank you again, and shukran, and Ramadan Mubarak to all my Muslim friends and comrades.
Thank you very much. So our next recorded intervention is by Mr. Paul Murphy, member of the Irish Parliament.
Paul Murphy here, TD with People Before Profit in Ireland, member of the National Parliament. Firstly, my apologies for not being able to be with you for this very, very important discussion live and having to pre-record a message. I hope that the discussion is productive and assists in sharing information and helping to build the kind of powerful Palestine solidarity movement that is desperately needed in the world today. What we are seeing in Gaza, what we see in the news, what we see on our phones, what we read in the newspapers, is war crime after war crime being committed by Israel in its genocidal assault on the Palestinian people. And the latest war crime is the use of starvation, of famine, as a weapon of war. it is crystal clear that the Israeli establishment, the political elite, has decided to starve the people of Gaza, bringing at least 500,000 people now to the point of starvation. They are refusing to allow in anywhere near the necessary amount of aid. Then, horrendously, when people were trying to get food aid, mowed down by Israeli forces. Absolute horror taking place. The world's leaders, certainly in the Western world, are crying crocodile tears about this happening. The US is talking about developing a port in order to bring aid to the Palestinian people. But the truth is that these are entirely false, because this starvation could not be happening, this famine could not be happening, this genocide could not be happening without the active support of the Western leaders, in particular of the US administration. Right now, we know that the US administration has made noises about suggesting that, the ground invasion of Rafah, which will mean tens of thousands of more deaths on top of the over 30,000 people who have already been killed, suggesting that ground invasion shouldn't go ahead until there is a plan to safely evacuate the Palestinians. So a hint of kind of caution and concern. But again, Netanyahu has made clear that he is determined to go ahead with this ground invasion, which will be an absolute horrendous slaughter. And then even if you have these evacuation plans put in place, what's that about? That's a continuation of the Nakba that is now ongoing, of driving the Palestinian people out of Gaza. That you told the people in Gaza, okay, you have to go to the safe zone, you have to go to the safe zone, the smaller safe zone, smaller safe zone. Now you've got 1.5 million people in Rafah at the border to Egypt, and now you're going to have a ground invasion and effectively force them out. It's absolutely horror beyond words being inflicted on the people of Gaza. And again, none of it could be happening without the active, ongoing political, military, economic support of the Western world, led by the US. We know that the US does about $4 billion of military aid a year, and now has a new package of $14.5 billion. It is absolutely shameful. It is important to note, I think, that millions of people in the Western world are horrified at what is happening to the Palestinian people, are horrified at their own leaders' complicity in the genocide, and are trying to build movements and protest against it. I mean, a big majority in America are in favor of a ceasefire. Millions of people have voted in protest in the Democratic primaries against Joe Biden for uncommitted, in order to demonstrate their opposition to what is happening. In Ireland, in Europe, you have major movements taking place demanding an end to the war and demanding that our own leaders, our own governments, actually take action that would have a meaningful impact on Israel. And all of that has had an impact. It has had an impact in terms of the kind of rhetoric used by Western leaders. It's had an impact in terms of some hesitant calls for humanitarian ceasefires. We'll see if anything more substantial emerges from the European Council that is taking place at the moment. They haven't been able to have conclusions over the last number of meetings. We'll see if they're able to agree conclusions now. But really, unfortunately, so far, the pressure has largely resulted in changes in rhetoric as opposed to changes in policy. Like, people, I'm sure, have seen that, like, relatively speaking, compared to other leaders of the Western world, the Irish government looks good on Israel-Palestine, in the sense that they actually criticise the Israeli government. They actually, even at this stage, condemn the assault, although they still refuse to use the word genocide. But if you look at the actual policies that are being implemented, they're a lot weaker than that. And they have refused to impose any sanctions on Israel, and in fact they're using a kind of parliamentary process which has never been used before to frustrate an attempt to get a bill, a law passed through the parliament to say that the Irish state should divest from any involvement in Israel, even any involvement in occupied territories, just. And they're trying to block that using a very, very undemocratic manoeuvre. They refuse to expel the Israeli ambassador. We got recent evidence suggesting that the number of weapons being carried through Ireland, presumably on US military aircraft, has dramatically increased since October of last year. So it looks like it's very related to Israel's war on the Palestinian people, but the Irish government refuses to inspect those. The Irish government has written a letter with the Spanish government calling for a review of the terms of the EU-Israel Association Agreement and the human rights clause that exists there. But again, it's nowhere near enough. I mean, that agreement needs to come to an end. That gives preferential access to Israel to the European market, when in reality we need full sanctions, expulsion of ambassador, an end to trade links, an end to the military links that still exist in terms of even the Irish government buying goods from the Israeli military, therefore funding the Israeli military industrial complex. So all of that, and I finish on this, is on us in terms of the movement that we're trying to build. And there's still very large protests every weekend. You know, the public is very clear, but we need to find ways to bring that pressure to bear on our own political establishments in order to maximise everything, do everything that we can to bring the genocide and the famine to an end.
Yes, thank you to all of our guests who have stayed with us until now. So we'll have one closing word from each one of you. Let's start with Mr. Chris Nineham. Hello, Chris, can you hear us? Okay, we can move to Dr. Noah Shainlinger.
Okay, so I think that there are two things happening. First of all, the global movement in solidarity with Palestinians obviously is kind of at its peak right now. But in terms of the ability of governments to exact pressure on Israel, we're not there yet. But I will say this. If you look historically, for example, at 1956, which was the first Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip and also the Sinai Peninsula, Israel wanted to annex the Gaza Strip. But really at the beginning of 1957, it is international pressure, led by the US, by the way, Eisenhower administration, that eventually led Israel to reluctantly withdraw. So international pressure is something that works, is something that in certain contexts can emerge. Except that I still don't see how we're getting from where we are now to real pressure on Israel to stop what it's doing. Definitely not through the Biden administration, definitely not through the UN Security Council. I'm probably the most pessimistic of this whole group.
You're muted, Sophia.
Could you please unmute yourself? We can't hear you, Sophia.
Yes, here I am. So yeah, I said that, Noah, maybe you're pessimistic. We are all, maybe you're most. But unfortunately, we can only be pessimistic in this current situation. So we go back to Mr. Chris Nineham, your last words for this webinar.
Thanks, Safia, and thank you everyone for a very interesting discussion. And it's, in a way, the kind of very interesting to get different people's perspective as to whether we are approaching a tipping point now. And I think it's difficult to be absolutely clear. about what the immediate prospects are. But I think what is clear is that though the Israelis are clearly winning militarily and have caused an almost unimaginable amount of damage in the process, they are overall in the long term losing politically. And I think they're losing politically both in terms of the legitimacy of their foreign policy on the world stage, in terms of the reputational damage that is being done both to the Israelis and to the fact of continuing US support for Israel. But they're also losing politically in the domestic realm, in the US, in Britain, in other countries. Those who are continuing to uncritically support, or even with marginal criticisms in reality to support what Israel is doing, are moving towards a kind of crisis of legitimacy, I think. And that's certainly something that's playing out in Britain at the moment. I don't know, it's impossible to predict exactly how that will work, the speed of the process, but I definitely feel as if we've come to a point where nothing will ever be the same when it comes to Israel's image in the world. Nothing will ever be the same when it comes to the ability of the Western powers to kind of get away with their ongoing support for the Israelis. So yeah, I share a sense of outrage and a sense of frustration and a sense of desperation, really, given the level of suffering. But I also feel as if we've got to the point where things will change in the coming period.
Thank you very much, Chris, for being with us today, and thank you for your words. So next we'll go with Dr. Lex Tackenberg. Your last words for this webinar.
Thank you very much for all the inspiring and wise interventions by the other participants of this very interesting webinar. From my perspective, real pressure on Israel will not come so much from political and diplomatic efforts and avenues, although they are eventually important. We see that the Israeli government is to a large extent supported in its war on Gaza by the Israeli Jewish public, and I believe that pressure on this public at large will come in two significant ways, and pressure to the point that their behavior will change will come in two important ways. One is, and I echo what Naomi, our colleague from Kenya, was mentioning, economic pressure, and that's why I call for indeed an amplification and a tsunami of the BDS campaign. This is the moment. This is also the moment to keep highlighting the dramatic contrast with Ukraine, where boycotts, divestment, and sanctions were put in place in less than 72 hours after Russia invaded Ukraine just over 2 years ago. So BDS is absolutely the time to amplify and to strengthen. More generally, educating and naming and shaming is critical, and there can't be enough of it, both vis-a-vis the Israeli public, but also globally vis-a-vis those who are still confused and find it difficult to engage. And then the second big sort of lever is indeed accountability. I was very happy to hear about the initiatives of the 13th of March movement. And as I already mentioned in my earlier intervention, there is really a tsunami of legal initiatives around the world. And this is what will have an impact. If Israelis begin to realize that they run the risk of being arrested, being on Interpol lists if they sort of after their military service want to travel around the world, as a lot of Israeli young people would like to do. This begins to sort of change has the potential to change their behavior. Many Israelis, as we know, have double citizenship. They have both Israeli passports and passports of third countries. Those third countries have power to hold their citizens, even if they have, joined Israeli citizenship, to account. And South Africa has announced that they would do this, and a number of Western countries have done the same. Our colleague from the 13th of March movement referred to the French case that came to light only a few days ago. So these are key issues. Final point. Yes, it is very hard to bring aid physically into Gaza until such time as a ceasefire will come into place. But I still call during these months of Ramadan on people to channel their zakat and other donations to UNRWA, not just as a measure to provide some relief to the dramatic UNRWA budget shortfall that the organization has been facing, but also as a demonstration of support to the 30,000 mostly Palestinian UNRWA employees, including the 13,000 in Gaza. As we know, more than 160 UNRWA employees have been killed in Gaza. So by channeling zakat to UNRWA at this particularly critical time, there is a dramatic demonstration of support for the agency that, once aid can come in bigger quantities, has the infrastructure, has the potential, has the people, has the trust of the Gaza population in being able to scale up urgently needed aid. So please do not forget and do not let down. If our leaders do, let us as individuals not let down UNRWA at this critical time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lex. And I guess this webinar is proof that people will not let down easily. So I'll have one last word also from Mr. Hani Medhoum. Hani, the floor is yours.
I believe Mr. Hani is not here, so we can move to Ms. Naomi.
Yes. Naomi, can you hear us? Yes. We can't hear you. You're muted.
Thank you so much for the very
Yes.
insightful conversations that are happening here. While the situation is gloomy, but it's also promising that people are standing up and people are committed to stand in radical solidarity with our comrades in Palestine. I just wanted to say in conclusion that it is very clear that Israelis' approach of denial of entry and access to humanitarian aid, destruction of bakeries, farms, attacks, the flower massacres on during distribution, aid distribution, and the withdrawal of UNRWA funding, for me, is a very systematic approach that is linked to the war to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, where you have over 570,000 Palestinians a step away from famine. Clearly, we can see it is another strategy. They have used the bombing. They have used the destruction of every other essential services. Now they are using food and famine and hunger. Clearly, it is a well laid down systematic destruction that contributes to the general genocide. And so we can only shout, we can only speak out. And I think for those of us who can't do much to the Israeli embassy and the other complicit governments, we can lend our mouths to the Palestinian cause. So the weapon that we must not allow to go off are our mouths. So our mouths must remain these weapons that we use to this cause. Thank you so much for having me on board. I really appreciate.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Naomi, and thank you to all of our guests. It has been a very constructive conversation, and let's hope again by our next webinar there is a ceasefire. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.